I'm rolling.
Ryan Chenkie is a developer advocate at Prisma. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Hey, thanks so much. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's great to have you. We've had Jason, your colleague from Prisma, on as well. And what's funny is I had actually reached out to you because I saw you were doing some Nexus talks. I was like, we really want to know more about Nexus. And you're like, oh yeah, sure, but really, you should get Jason on. And it was great. That was such a fantastic episode. So thank you for that recommendation. And now we're here to have you on to talk about the stuff you're working on. But first, let's get a little bit of your background. How'd you get into programming, and how'd you find your way to Prisma?
Sure, yeah. I have been in programming now for, I was actually thinking about this the other day. I guess this is like year 9, sort of, because like my very first touch with programming in its current form was back in like 2012. But like that's when I just like was a super noob, and I just got into HTML and CSS a little bit haphazardly. I started and stopped a couple times trying out just some basic web development stuff, and then over the next few years, I started to learn it more thoroughly. But I've been working in the industry since 2015. My first job was in 2015 with Auth0, doing some kind of DevRel type stuff with them. But since then, I've done a lot of stuff. I've worked as a consultant, doing application builds for companies, and I've created a lot of content. I've got a lot of courses out, and yeah, working at Prisma now. So yeah, I've touched a lot of different areas, I suppose, of programming, and I've been at it, I suppose, career-wise, job-wise, for, I guess this is like the 6th year, even though I've sort of been touching it for at least 8 or 9 years now.
Oh, that's cool. That's actually not as long as I would have been expecting. That's pretty cool. You've made it pretty far in a pretty short amount of time. So congrats on that. I'm in a similar boat. Just getting started with my professional journey now, but I've been kind of learning to code for a couple of years now. So it's always cool when I see someone who hasn't been at this like since they were just a kid who's still been able to get to be pretty successful. And you had worked at Auth0 before Prisma, right?
Yep. Yeah. Auth0 from 2015 to 2017. And then I went out on my own, did some consulting, and basically spent a couple of years, I guess it was like 2.5 years or whatever, building apps for companies and doing kind of like freelance, I guess you could call it, consulting stuff. I had a good number of clients. And then I was interested in going back to work at a company because one thing that's really not great about going out on your own is that you're no longer surrounded by a team of like really smart developers to help you get better and push yourself to learn more and stuff like that. And so what I really noticed is that my learning really started to plateau as I was out on my own. I was just kind of, single developer working on stuff and having a lot of fun, but my learning was really plateauing. I was not learning new stuff. I was not developing myself as a programmer as much anymore. So I wanted to get back into the realm of, a team that was super talented and would kind of push me to excel.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely feel that. For me, I couldn't really learn anything on my own. It wasn't really until I started getting together with like some of the Redwood people that I started like really getting to accelerate. And so that's definitely a huge thing that you need. You need these people around you who are constantly pushing you and just be like, hey, let's go work on this project. Like, well, I don't know how to do that project. Like, well, let's figure it out then. And then, you get to work through it with people, and it's always super, super fun. And how did you first hear about Prisma? Did they reach out to you, or did you hear about them?
So I've known Johannes for a long time. I guess since 2016. Back in the GraphQool days when they were getting started, that's when I was at Auth0. And how did that go? He had reached out to me, he had reached out maybe to Auth0 more broadly and got filtered down to me, I think, about doing some kind of collaboration on content and whatnot. And then I would see him at GraphQL events, I guess every year basically. So he and I knew each other for a while, and he reached out to me to ask me basically if I would have any interest in coming to work at Prisma. And that was, that was for a little while before I made the decision to to go back to a company after consulting for a while. And so it took a little bit of convincing, but it was very much the case that like if I was going to make a jump back to it, the Prisma was the right spot to go. Like I really love what the company's doing. I love the open source nature of it. The product is great. The people are awesome. So it made a lot of sense. And so he was able to strong arm me into to come and to work at Prisma. And that is that was last year. Yeah, now we're in 2021. So that was 2020. That was like, I guess the spring of 2020. And then I started there in July. That was my kind of official start, was the beginning of July last year.
Yeah, that makes sense because you had spoken for a Redwood meetup actually, and this was towards the end of, it was like September or October, I think, and you had been working there for about 3 months or so. So yeah, that all tracks. And what you did that I thought was really cool is you did a demonstration of how to do relations with Prisma. And what I thought was cool about that is that you didn't just kind of like show up and just like do any old demo. You really like picked a specific demo that you knew was a pain point with Redwood developers. It's something that we would be interested in seeing and learning. And I thought that was really cool. I thought it was like very thoughtful, and you didn't just like go and say, I just want to go show you some Prisma stuff. And I think that shows the kind of thoughtfulness that a good developer advocate has, because we've talked about like the role of a developer advocate, what exactly it means, whether it's more community, whether it's more content creation, whether it's more tooling, whether it's a combination of all of them. So how do you think about that role and what your responsibilities are?
Yeah, and appreciate the comments. Thank you. It's an interesting role because you've got a lot of hats that you've got to wear as a developer advocate, right? There's, of course, the need to be proficient in programming to some extent. Maybe arguably, you don't have to be the most super talented of engineers working on like super obscure stuff to be successful as a developer advocate. At least I'm definitely not the most talented engineer there ever was. But you've got to have some proficiency, of course, with being a developer. But I think the one of the biggest aspects of it too that goes way beyond that is being able to have a lot of empathy with people in general, but especially with developers out there, because much of the role is understanding the issues that people come up across, maybe even being able to see issues that exist without even being told explicitly what the issues are. So like if people are frustrated with a product or frustrated with like an open source library, something, what have you, it's great if you're able to sort of sense that without necessarily being told that there's an issue, right? I mean, you can go cruise through GitHub issues and see that there are problems with the libraries, but being able to get a sense of that just through chatter online. And so not only that, but also being able to speak to that crowd in an empathetic way, being able to sort of communicate with them in ways that show that you care for what they're going through. You care about the struggles that are happening, and you want to support them. I think that's a big part of it, is like this desire to support people to be successful in their endeavors with whatever they're working on. So that's kind of like I suppose like the maybe I'd call it the emotional side of it, if you will. In terms of like the skills that go into it, I mean, it's a lot of stuff depending on what you're focusing on, but it's a lot of like writing skills, doing talks, so being able to give a public talk, and also being able to do video stuff. Those three things, I see that those as some important key pillars of the job. And you wrap all that up, and if you've got the kind of the interest in it, then I think you've got a case for being a developer advocate. That's at least one way that I look at it. But it's certainly multifaceted. There's different areas, I think, of specialization too. Yeah, one thing about it is that I think it's kind of unique too. It's a job that whoever is in the position of being a developer advocate, it's not like a cookie cutter role so much, right? Like it really relies on a lot of uniqueness that the individual brings to the table. At least that's what I've experienced myself.
To what I understand is you first worked with Angular and then moved to more React, and now you're with Prisma, that's more of a backend company. But one of the strides that I've seen that kind of goes through all of them is security. Security is something that we all can struggle with sometimes to truly understand the scope of it and how important it is, and it can always be put on the back burner to, make better another day. But it's one of these things is, what would you say, if we was going to take it in steps to go from a completely or open back end or unauthenticated front end is what would you say the first steps are to slowly make it more and more secure? Almost like test coverage. What's the most important thing to do first to make something more secure?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. You've got to look at the context of what you're building for sure. So the question of like, how do you start on making an endpoint, let's just say an endpoint, more secure, depends on what it's doing. Maybe there are two broad cases. There are endpoints that you would want to limit access to so that only, let's say, authenticated users can get access to them. And that's the case of an application that uses these endpoints where you have to be logged into the thing to make use of it. There's that bucket, and then I think there's another bucket which is like you've got an open endpoint where it's a public API or something like that, or otherwise you're calling that endpoint through an application where the user doesn't need to be logged in to use it. And so there are two ways that you might approach it to begin with. And I think broadly, if you're taking the approach of the endpoint for a private application, you got to be logged in to use the thing. The first thing you need is a way to authenticate requests to that endpoint. And so what that looks like is you need to be able to tell something from the HTTP request that comes to that endpoint as to whether or not the user or service or whatever that's calling that endpoint should be allowed to get access to it. One of the easiest ways to think about this gets very broad, but one of the easiest ways to think about it is to think about like a user logs into an application and then they want to do some things in it that would make a call to those endpoints to get data back, let's say. Where you start with generally is you want to authenticate a user. You want to get a user to be authenticated in the application before they can do anything. So this is where it's good to look at the difference between authentication and authorization. So authentication is when the user comes to the application and they are able to prove that they are who they say they are. In a typical scenario, that would happen at some point in time, and then there would be some kind of setup in place. This could be many things. It could be cookies and sessions or JSON web tokens. There would be something in place such that requests to that endpoint would be authorized. So this is the other auth type. Is first you do authentication and then you have to do authorization. Authorization is different because it is not the user proving that they are who they say they are every time they ask for information. Rather, it's the user supplying some kind of artifact along with their request so that the endpoint can make a determination that the user is authorized to get access to that data, let's say. That's a typical setup with a user. You expand this out to various other scenarios where maybe it's like services that are making calls to another service. Like maybe you've got a backend that runs on a schedule and it needs to make requests from machine to machine communication. So it's not quite like a user calling a service, for example. But in any case, if you've got an endpoint that needs to be protected so that it only releases information to someone who's allowed to use it, you kind of need to start there. If you're taking the other bucket where it's a public endpoint and you just want to kind of secure it, make it robust in some fashion, you start in a different direction. But this direction also applies, I think, to the private endpoints once you get past that initial setup phase of having authentication and authorization. In this scenario, really what you want to do is a few things. You want to make sure that your endpoints aren't going to be abused. So what does that look like? You could have people writing scripts that would just be pinging your endpoints endlessly, and so trying to carry out some kind of denial of service attack on you. And, there's lots of reasons why someone might do that. It could be just because they don't like you or your application. That's, definitely one reason. Or it could be trying to disrupt your business so that you're not going to succeed or whatever. There could be, there's plenty of reasons that people might want to do something like that.
Could be a foreign actor, right?
Foreign actors, yeah. Like it could be political stuff. There's all sorts of reasons. And it's a very real thing. This happens to people every day. There's no shortage of these kinds of attempts made. And so in those cases, what you're looking to do is protect your endpoint in various ways. And one thing you might want to start with is rate limiting. And so rate limiting kind of looks at the number of incoming requests from a specific IP address, let's say, in a given time span. And if it exceeds some threshold, you'll want to start to deny those requests. So rate limiting helps you to It kind of helps in the sense that you'll not be giving up information from your API. If you've determined that the user is probably a bot or a bad actor or something, you can stop your API from releasing information to the user. One of the issues, though, is that depending on how your rate limiting is set up, let's say it's set up just at your application level, you're still going to incur the cost of receiving and processing those requests, even though you've put some kind of blockage in place. So kind of what you want to do is really move that upstream. And so what you would want to do is start to completely block. Hopefully, you've got a setup that can do this. If you're using like AWS, this is fairly simple to do with firewalls. Essentially what you want to do is like put some kind of web application firewall in place, something that can look at the incoming requests outside of your application layer and determine whether or not it should pass that request through to your endpoint. And so if you use like Cloudflare or AWS, you can deal with that traffic outside of your app. And if you want to bounce out that traffic, you can, and then your application layer doesn't need to process the request. So those are pretty big things that apply both to like public APIs, yes, but also your private APIs too, even if you've got authentication in place. Because like a bad actor could get a token, which would allow them to authenticate at your API, and they could be trying to, just get as much information as they can from that endpoint or something, and they could be sending plenty of requests that it would be unreasonable to expect that many requests from a regular user. You want to put that kind of protection in place there too. Those are some of the broad things. Any more specific things you want to look at with those two, or what do you think?
Say you got a public service that you want authenticated. For example, a checkout. You want the guest who hasn't logged in to be the only one to call the private APIs to obviously complete checkout, for example. How would you do that in your sense of security? To me, it seems like the best way would first call an API to get a hash or a key, and then every time that user then calls them more private APIs, they would then ask for that hash. But I don't know.
So let's play this scenario out a bit. So there's a private endpoint or set of private endpoints. What would those be responsible for?
Take an e-commerce example. So you have a guest who's not authenticated, as in logged in, but they need to hit, say, private endpoints. That's like complete checkout, view order. Is this thing, how would you authenticate them on a private checkout if they've not done any authentication necessarily?
I guess it depends on your application's needs and everything, but like, there's a couple ways you could hit that. And I've never implemented like this whole flow myself, so I'm speculating here, and this is just me thinking off the cuff as to how I might do this. But in a guest checkout scenario, I think typically what you want for an e-commerce setting is you want to have the shopping cart state be retained, even if like a user is to leave and then come back. So let's say they haven't authenticated because they don't have an account, they want to check out as a guest, they've got items in their cart, they close the browser tab, they come back, we want to still show those. So a couple of ways to do that, right? You can keep some state in like local storage and browser storage. This is information that is not really private stuff, right? Like it's cart items aren't necessarily something for the most part it's going to matter. If somebody like has a cross-site scripting attack that's going to like see what's in your local storage for that, that's a whole nother subject. But in this case, probably not a bad idea to have cart items in local storage. So you could maintain state that way, and then when you go to do the checkout, I'm thinking of a typical flow at checkout. If you're a guest, you've got to provide your email address and your other stuff. And then when you go to pay, to me, just thinking initially about this, I don't know if purchasing is necessarily, if that needs to be a private endpoint. I think that's like that's probably a public endpoint that takes in a payload with all your particulars from your form, email address, the items, and price and all that stuff. You'd want to protect that endpoint such that it can't be easily abused. Like you might want to have some kind of not necessarily like a reCAPTCHA, but like something that works to the same effect. Something that can say, this request came from a browser, looks like it's a legit user, not a bot trying to hit the endpoint with a fake credit card number or whatever. I mean, of course, you're going to do your credit card processing and verification and hopefully offload that to like Stripe so that they can determine if the card is legit or not. But yeah, to me, just thinking about it initially, I don't know if that's a private endpoint necessarily, the endpoint to purchase things.
And I think that brings it on to a really good security question is what is defined as public and private? Because in my head, I would think that almost every mutation would be a private endpoint that needs authenticating. But what you're saying is actually some mutations are okay to be public mutations, like checkout.
Yeah, and that's because in this scenario, we're accepting the fact that we're making this trade-off that says we care more about people completing their purchases than we do about them having actual accounts with our service. Therefore, let's treat this purchasing experience kind of like a contact form on your website, let's say. With your contact form, the endpoint that might be hit to submit that data isn't going to be a private endpoint. It's going to be public because there's no user session to speak of. So in that way, the guest checkout experience is kind of like just submitting data through a contact form. We're just accepting the fact that we're going to get some user info like their email address and their name. And in this case, instead of like a message in the contact form, we're going to get their credit card number, let's say. I think that's largely a public endpoint, but so back to your question, what separates them? Like what's public and what's private? I think of private endpoints as ones where, to start with, it's any kind of endpoint that would be hit when you build an application that should only be accessible by logged in users. So when we want the user to have to be logged in to use it, basically it's like you want to prevent usage by just like random people. You want to be able to know who's using your thing. And something that kind of gets like built in through that whole effect that gets like interwoven is the fact that like when you hit an endpoint as a logged in user, a private endpoint, most often you're going to need to supply like identity information about the user. So like a user ID to say, when I make a mutation, save it with this user ID or whatever. That's often going to need to be supplied along with your request. So you kind of have this like interwoven fact of identity being part of like the private experience. In cases where you don't care that the user is logged in, I think that's where you opt for the public thing. Roughly speaking, I mean, that's a generalization, but that's kind of how I think about it.
The reason we ask these security questions is because you've actually wrote your own course about security and React. Does it cover just the front end of security and React, or does it also cover the back end?
Yeah, Backend too. It's Fullstack. Yeah, it basically shows you how you would deal with security in the Fullstack context and why it's, when we're thinking about security and auth within like a React application, you kind of really need to involve the Fullstack for it to make sense.
And what is the backend in that course? Like what database and what server are you using?
Yeah, it's an Express API, so Node, and it is a Mongo database that we use. This was pre-Prisma that I made that course. So like nowadays, if I were to re-record it, I'd probably just like use Prisma on top of Postgres. That would be what I'd go for. But yeah, it was Mongo. And so, but the database, it's really just kind of like a detail. The super important part that I draw out in the course is like, when you think about your front end, you've got to keep in mind that there's no real concept of like security in a React application. There are ways to sort of like give hints that your users might be authenticated in your application, but there's no way to know for sure, and that's because React applications run in the browser, or if you're doing React Native, they run in a mobile environment. But the point about like browser-based application security is that you need to involve a backend for security to make any sense at all, because it's on the backend where any kind of determination about an authentication state for the user can be determined. That's the only place where it makes sense to do that. Browsers are public clients and they need to be treated as such. That you need to just expect that nothing can be trusted essentially in the browser, is what it comes down to.
Part of it's a free course and then part of it's a paid course. It was done last year, so it's still quite relevant content till today. And also, obviously, what I probably understand is it's not necessarily about the frameworks or the databases it's using, it's the patterns that is what you mostly take away from it. One of my final security questions that I always think is interesting to know, how does one go about making API keys to give to people? You have a user, but now you've added an API to your service. How do you authenticate an API?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and I think there's kind of two patterns you see with this. you'll find services. So let's say you're making an application. Part of it is an API, and you want third-party developers to be able to use your API to, tie into your service somehow. So the typical way you could do it is you could have like a spot in your backend, a spot within your user interface where it says, give me an API key because I want to tie into the service. So typically when you get an API key like that, you've got like some kind of like app ID, let's say, which is supposed to be like treated as public. And then you've got another thing, which is like your API secret or whatever. Sometimes they're just in one single key. Like it doesn't have to be split out into two. And so with that, that's typically the let's call it an API secret key or whatever. It's a long random string of characters. You probably want to make sure it's URL safe, so you don't want to have like certain symbols in there. So typically people would just have letters and numbers. Give it a length of 64 characters. Make it random, whatever. Hopefully use some kind of library which helps gives you like a pseudo random generation.
Like Nano ID is one that I always see pop up.
Nano ID? Okay. I'm not familiar with that one. But something like that where it's like, it focuses on generating something that is approximating true randomness because for those unfamiliar, it's actually very difficult, if not impossible, to actually produce random things with computers. So that's the idea. You just give a long, and so what it becomes is like, it's just a super strong password essentially, right? Your third-party services calling into your API, you're just relying on them producing a really strong, unguessable password and then just sending you that password every time to authenticate. The other way to do it, which a lot of services use these days, is to have like a whole OAuth setup where, so a third-party service would need to truly authenticate through the OAuth protocol with your API before it can actually get access to it. And this requires a lot of steps quite often. Like you have to initially get like a code, like if you're going through the code flow, they call it, like you have to get a code. And then you send that code to another endpoint to produce a token, and then you have to store that token. The token's only valid for a certain amount of time, so you have to have a refresh token, which is you're going to store somewhere and like refresh the access token. And so it's a big complicated flow, and some services make it stupidly like complicated to actually do what you want to do. And one that I was frustrated with recently was the Instagram Graph API. So I was looking to like just get like a list of recent posts on Instagram via the API, and like figuring out actually how to do it through the Facebook developers portal was just a nightmare. Anyway, there are a lot of services that will do this much more easily for you, but Facebook is not one of them. So you've got two sort of approaches. I think generally OAuth, you can consider that more secure because you have a proper authentication flow in place. Access tokens only have a certain lifetime, etc. Tons of security things to think about in that scenario, but maybe arguably more secure than just like a super strong password, which is the other variety.
When you think about, say, a super strong password, let's take Stripe as just the example, one of the ones. It gives you an SK key that, is very secret, don't give to anyone, because it allows you to use Stripe. This is a question that I don't necessarily know is, when you make a key, is that key to a team normally, or is that key to a user as a JWT token? Because a JWT token and SK random letters are very different ththings that give you very different types of data back.
Yeah, and a JSON Web Token, like it extends beyond just like thinking about a user as like an actual person, like a human user. It also, a JSON Web Token can be tied to like a machine that is making calls. It can get very granular even. Like it can be tied to like a given, what's an example? Like tied to a specific channel within a Slack organization, something like that, right? So when you generate a key, I forget how it looks in Stripe. I haven't been in there in the developer spot in a while, but I think generally for a lot of these services where you go in and you're like, hey, give me an API key, and I need to make a call to your API. It'll be for like an individual user of that application. Let's say you have some kind of like team login. I think it's going to be the case where, all three of us, let's say we're on a developer team, we all use this service, we want to get it to give us an API key. We're probably all going to see that same API key if we log into that service, and then any one of us could then copy it over to the spot that it needs to go. In that case, it's more like an API key is going to be associated with like an application, I guess you could call it, or some kind of like a record of which you create within that application. You say, hey, I've got a third-party service. It's called FooBar application. We're going to have our users do this with it. I need an API key for it. That's kind of the model I think that most people go for.
Do you tend to see user authentication? A lot of people tend not to roll it themselves these days. They use, Auth0, Netlify, even Magic.links is a new one that's popping up a lot. But really, like, API keys, do you tend to see that a lot of people would tend to just run their own system where it just keeps the key in the database, or do they also use third-party services to generate them keys a lot?
Would that be the case if like you are creating an application and an API, you want to enable third-party developers and you want to have some way to, yeah, that's interesting. It's a good question. I don't know of a service necessarily that would do that. So like, I guess we have to look at both sides of it though. Like if you just want the super strong password variety, I don't know of any services that are built just for that, because I think it's such a small scope really. Like you need a library that's going to give you a good password. You need to follow best practices, etc. But if it's for the OAuth setup, that's actually what Auth0 like kind of specializes in. Like Auth0, a lot of people think about it as like, hey, I'm building an application. I need to give a way for my users to log in, so I'm going to drop in Auth0, and that's definitely one way to use it. But like a whole other way, which maybe people get even more, arguably would get more value from, is Auth0 is a great way to say, hey, I've got an application and I want third-party developers to be able to make use of it. I need to provide the whole infrastructure and rules and all of that for people to be able to do the OAuth transactions that need to take place to allow them to hit my API. In that way, you can set up your whole like third-party experience within Auth0. That's going to solve that OAuth scenario for you. But for that, for the other scenario, at least what comes to mind initially for me is like, I just need to find a library that's going to give me pseudo-random password generation.
It's always interesting to know these things because, you're a developer in a business and they go, okay, we're making this API. How do you even think about the security? It's always such a hard question is, where do you even go to read about these things? Stack Overflow? Like, well, it's interesting you bring up Auth0 as Auth0 is a lot more than just user logins, because I think user logins are always the first thing everyone would do with Auth0. The other such an interesting subject is social logins, and if you necessarily think they're good things or bad things, because I always think they're a bit of both.
You think they're like good and bad?
So why I say good and bad, I think like conversions tend to be higher because, they just click login with Facebook or Google on public applications. But then you're also losing a lot of that control when it comes to structure and your login process as passwords and usernames and all the other things.
Definitely see the side where it's good and bad. The good points of social logins would come down to like, you don't have to then build your own authentication stuff yourself. You can defer to Facebook or Google or whatever. And I think a lot of that is like the benefits there would be like, you don't have to worry about your passwords getting breached. That's a big thing. On the flip side though, it's like if you're going to do just like username and password authentication, which I mean you probably I guess shouldn't in this day and age, like there's not a great reason to solely support username and passwords. You should probably do something else. The process of doing that yourself, as long as you follow like the best practices with it, it can be decently secure. Like, you need to make sure that you're hashing and salting your passwords and doing all that sort of stuff. And there's libraries that, depending on what framework you're in and what language you're in, there's going to be libraries that'll do all that for you. So it's not a big deal really, I don't think, to do it on your own. So arguably more secure with social because you offload all of that stuff to the provider. I think the benefits to as an application developer of using social is you get like profile enrichment for your users. You need to ask them to consent to give you certain pieces of info, but as long as they do, you can build a bigger picture of your users and be able to I don't know, sell them things more easily. I don't know, something like that. So there's that. And then I guess the downsides for me would be like, I don't know. People don't really like some social providers these days. Of course, Facebook comes top of my mind, but I think I don't know if trust is being lost in a lot of them. Like I don't know if you'd find anyone that is wary of like logging in with Google because they're upset at Google for something or another. But I don't know. Maybe it is a thing. I'm not sure. I don't have a lot of the pulse on that. I do know that like because I'm not a big fan of Facebook, like if given the option, I will generally never log in with Facebook.
I think you'll find people who feel the same way about Google, or feel the same way about Facebook, or feel the same way about both of them. So it kind of depends person to person. But while we still got you here, I really want to get into some Prisma stuff. So let's kind of close this out. Is there anything else you want to hit on that, Bernsey? Are you good?
Just a hot take. It's a yes or no. Passwordless logins the future?
In some form, I think so. I'm really keen on web authentication, where you use like a fingerprint reader and you're immediately logged into a website.
Yeah, if you think someone's afraid to give Facebook their password, imagine giving Facebook your fingerprint.
Yeah, you wouldn't give it through Facebook.
The user doesn't know that though; they don't know the difference.
Yeah, I'm curious to see.
It's a super new thing.
Yep, super new.
It's still behind a lot of Chrome flags as well. But in all essence, what it is you type in your email address and then click like the fingerprint icon and then put your finger on the fingerprint scanner and now you're logged in. Obviously, super new technology that's still in development. So yeah, Prisma.
Let's talk a little bit about just what Prisma is. First of all, I think a lot of our listeners are already going to know it's really a key pillar of FS Jam, but I'd be curious to hear how you describe it today, because you guys have been a bit fluid in how you describe it.
Yeah, for sure. We've kind of reverted back in our description of it, because we used to call it an ORM, and then there was, I guess, reason to maybe not call it an ORM, just based on some technical details, I suppose, of Prisma. But what we came to a realization of is that it's an uphill battle to try to, describe something to someone in terms that they're not familiar with.
When you were at the Redwood meetup, actually, I had asked you, when is Prisma going to admit that they built an ORM?
There you go. Yeah, that's right.
At that point, you hadn't done it yet, you hadn't made the switch yet, but I was sensing it. I was sensing it was in the air.
We made the admission. Yeah, so Prisma is an open source ORM that gives developers a really clean API, a really clean way to access databases. Right now, at the time of this recording, it's all relational databases. So there's Postgres, MySQL, MSSQL, SQLite. I think I might be missing one, but I'm not sure. But the support for Mongo is on the way. It's on the roadmap, and it's actively being worked on. And so what does that look like? What does that translate to? It's like if you want to access a database from a backend, let's say in Node. Currently, we support Node and Go. But if you want to do it in Node, instead of writing raw SQL queries like select star from table where, etc., instead of doing that, you'll go through Prisma, which is basically you write a bit of code to do that. And the way that looks is that you start with a model. You start with a Prisma model. So Prisma not only gives you like this API for accessing your data, it gives you all the tools you need for managing your databases in the first place. The Prisma model gives you a way to describe your tables in your database. And then we have products like Prisma Migrate, which allows you to run migrations on your database, put your tables in place, seed them with data if you want. And then we've got other stuff like Prisma Studio, which allows you to view your database. It's like a Table Plus alternative, for example. It runs in the browser or in an Electron app. We've got really intelligent things that surround all of that, like IntelliSense. It's all TypeScript. You get generated TypeScript types, which means that your database access is type safe. And what that translates to, the reason I really like that, is that it becomes very difficult to do something with your database that is invalid. So that at the time that you write your code, you can be pretty certain that what your code is trying to do with your database is something that is sound, because the TypeScript types that get generated will prevent you from doing the wrong thing.
And then something else I find interesting about that is I've noticed that when you have Prisma, like you say, because of the TypeScript, and then you also have a GraphQL API, because that is basically defining types, is kind of what that's doing, you are able to write JavaScript and get a lot of the same benefits you would get from writing TypeScript without necessarily having to do it. I find you still get a lot of the same autocomplete and you still get a lot of the same errors. And I find that to be pretty interesting because there's, this whole tension between how deep we go into TypeScript or not. And so I like how we've set up, at least I've gotten to a place where I can have tooling that allows me to get a lot of the benefits from TypeScript without really having to write TypeScript.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting debate right now. TypeScript, of course, is like really taking off, but there are developers that are sticking with JavaScript. And one thing I've seen recently is that some library authors are actually reverting from TypeScript to JavaScript and just using JSDoc to get autocompletion.
Right. Rich Harris was talking about this, yeah.
Yeah, you saw that? Yeah. That's interesting. I guess there's some overhead with TypeScript that people don't want to deal with, which is of course fine. But I was curious. It was interesting to see that people are going from TypeScript back to JavaScript. I wouldn't have expected that necessarily.
Yeah, you're big into TypeScript. You did a really great TypeScript pocket guide that we'll link to in the show notes. I got a lot of value out of that so thanks for writing that.
You bet, yeah. Yeah, that was fun. Yeah, what's the story with TypeScript in Redwood these days? I remember talking to the guys a while ago and it was on the way. But any movement there?
Yeah, I think we just got a lot of the router stuff in there, I think is what we're working on. Chris will be closer to the ground on this. I know it's being worked on, but we're still not across the finish line yet.
It's currently in a middle period where it was working for me on 23. 24 got the router rewrote. It broken for me, so I can't upgrade to 24 right now. But there's fixes lined up for 25 after pre-rendering's been added. Because obviously that does a lot with, obviously, the routing and how that all works, really. So it's got a lot better in the months since. If you're wondering, the easiest way to see how it's all going is the roadmap. I think it's redwoodjs.com/roadmap. And it says where all the states are, and TypeScript's one of them, where it says how far along it is.
Nice. That's cool. Yeah. I think a lot of people starting projects these days have it in mind that, at least if they've got experience with TypeScript, that they probably wouldn't do a JavaScript project. I mean, that's the case for me anyway. Like, if I'm starting a new project, it's going to be TypeScript all the way down, largely because I know the benefits I can get from it, but also the fact that, because TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, if I really don't want to deal with types, I don't necessarily have to. I can just kind of go on my way. And I know there's some limitations to working with TypeScript. It's a little bit more overhead and whatever, but for me, it's worked out well. I think my development has improved for sure. The time it takes to write something and get it like working as it should be is much reduced, I think, because I catch so many things ahead of time.
What else do you think is going to be coming up this year for Prisma that you're looking forward to? You had mentioned Mongo support, and it sounds like Migrate is getting to a good place as well. So you can speak to either of those or anything else that's going on.
Yeah, I'm excited for basically like the final sort of general availability of all the pieces. Getting everything to general availability is going to be awesome. I think it's going to give people even more confidence that like, yep, all the core pieces are there, they're ready to go. I don't have to worry about regressions and whatnot. One of the challenges is that like Prisma 1, for those unfamiliar, Prisma 1 was like this hosted kind of GraphQL. Well, it was self-hosted. So anyway, let's take it all the way back. GraphQL was the initial incarnation of what is now Prisma. That was like a hosted GraphQL service. Your database would be hosted, and then a GraphQL API would be produced for you to easily get into your database, etc. Prisma 1 evolved to be something that you host yourself, but you get a GraphQL API. And now Prisma 2 is totally GraphQL agnostic. It's not concerned with what your API implementation is. It's just like tools and like I was mentioning earlier, this ORM that sits on top of your database, which makes working with databases way easier. And that's where the key value comes in. So all that to say, there's this issue that had developed over the course of time where people have been a little bit burnt by Prisma making such drastic changes to the product and changing directions a bit. I think now the people on Prisma 2 who really like it, once these general availability pieces stick in place, it's going to be like, okay, yeah, I feel really, really good about this. Nothing's going to change so substantially that it'll, wipe out my project. I think people will be super excited about that. So I'm stoked on that. And I think seeing what comes out of the developments around the commercial product offerings that are kind of taking place right now. There's, right now everything is kind of open source, but the actual strategy and commercial product side of things is in the works right now.
Do you have any speculation in that area of what direction you guys are at least thinking about? I know Jason had said that this is something that is still very new and exploratory right now, but I'm curious at least what you're thinking.
There is one that's on the public roadmap, and that's a hosted version of Studio.
Yeah, and I think that's what I can speak to mostly is the hosted experience. So Studio on the roadmap being something that people will benefit from. I think there's not a whole lot else I can say right now, but we can basically say building on the things that make Prisma awesome right now will be things that make working with databases in teams and in settings where there's a lot of data will be really good. It'll make for ease of use for developers working on large data sets and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's what Jason had said as well. He was talking about like the workflows around databases, which we've had guests on the show, like Chris Ball has talked about issues he's had with this. And so yeah, there's definitely a huge space, and this is kind of similar to what Peter Pistorius is working on as well. So making it easier to work with databases, I think, is definitely something that a lot of people are looking for. So that'll be exciting to see that.
The provider I'm more interested in for Prisma is actually CockroachDB than Mongo, because at one point in the future, my application will need to be hosted worldwide, and thinking about having to manage multiple versions of Postgres, Cockroach just seems to have that down from their marketing page.
Yep. The one I'm keen on myself personally is DynamoDB. I've just gotten into that, and it's really cool. And same benefits, right? Like you just create it within AWS, and you've got like global support, don't have to scale anything. It's awesome.
Yeah, if Prisma could start supporting DynamoDB, that could be huge.
Do you like Dynamo? Yeah.
Yeah, I like Dynamo, and I'm trying to get Redwood into a state where it could be entirely hosted just on AWS, like with the database, because that's the thing that we don't really have right now, is we can do all this stuff with Netlify or Vercel, which is all building on AWS, but that's still really more so the front end. And then we have the back end, which we usually would pull in like a Postgres database on Heroku or something like that. So I'm looking at things like Begin and, SAM and that sort of stuff, and trying to figure out how to get Redwood in some sort of like infrastructure as code setup that can be deployed just to AWS. And so getting the Dynamo piece is really important unless we want to use something like Aurora or RDS or the more relational offerings.
So what you want is, if I remember rightly, a mega CloudFront file that basically sets up AWS for you, is it? Is it CloudFront?
Well, that's what Begin and SAM are. Begin and SAM are both syntactic sugar on top of CloudFront. So yeah, that's the idea.
Okay. No, I guess that's it. Thank you for your time. How can our listeners find you?
Sure, yeah, you can find me on Twitter. That's where I'm kind of most active. Ryan Chenkie on Twitter, and I'm sure you'll probably put that as a link. And yeah, check out, if you're interested in the security stuff that we're talking about, reactsecurity.io is where you'll find details on that. There's a free course there and some pro courses too.
And you also have your own podcast?
Yeah, I do. So if you're interested in like business stuff, especially like indie hacking and stuff like that, the Entrepreneurial Coder podcast is the one I host. The website is ecpodcast.io. Yeah, I chat with like developers who are all, building side businesses or releasing books and courses and stuff like that, and getting to know what methods they go through to release products and do cool stuff.
Your latest one was Justin Jackson, who built Transistor.fm.
So he was one of the early guests. So maybe you saw a recent tweet. I've got some Twitter activity going where I just like retweet like older episodes. He was like last year or even the year before maybe. So anyway, that was a great episode though. He builds Transistor, which is the platform that I use for hosting.
We do too.
Oh, nice.
Everybody does. Well, only the cool podcasts do.
That's right.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you guys. Really good to talk to you.
Have a good one.
Awesome.